I have them.
Okay.
All right, so while the other group is setting up, you please go ahead and fill out the sheets for the first group, because we want to keep moving. And no, just keep them. I will collect them later. Isaiah, where are you sitting? Okay.
We'll introduce ourselves.
I like the name.
Does anybody know how to do it? Yeah, but I don't want it to play by itself.
It won't.
Okay.
So you put a timer on.
Okay, cool.
For sure.
I'm just gonna play it then. I see that. Okay. Cool. Sorry, I just want to like do the bench before we get into it so that we don't waste more time. Okay.
You got to the top. Hold on, let me just check.
Yeah, good.
Cool.
Notes. I'll stand over here, actually.
Good evening. Thank you. Someone knows. I'm Lewis. This is Quinton and Christine, and we like to call ourselves the LCQ Trio. So today's presentation will be devoted to one of the most representative pieces in chamber music literature, which is Fairytales, Opus 132 by Robert Schumann. So aside of performing some movements from this work, we will describe the historical atmosphere behind the piece, examine theoretical motives with comparison and transition from the Romantic from the Classical era, as well as give a brief insight on some info for Schumann's shining personas showcased to end this piece. So if you could hit this slide, please. Thanks. So who is Robert Schumann? Does anyone know? Thanks. It's a joke. But Robert Schumann was born on June 8, 1810, and passed away on July 29th in 1856. So he was a German pianist and composer. So although he only lived for 46 years, he was one of the most extraordinary musical innovators of this time. So his prophetic output on piano literature, chamber music, and orchestral works is still praised to this day. And a lot of the inspirations behind this piece came from those around him. So composers like Johannes Brahms, Albert Dietrich, who was a composer, Joseph Joachim, a violinist, were pioneers for this music along with Schumann. These were all part of the same social circle, so with the desire to preserve yet innovate the art of music. The relationship of Schumann, Brahms, and Dietrich was so inspirational and powerful, they actually created a piece called FAE, and they created it together, which is the one in the corner on the top. This was a sonata written as a surprise for Joseph Jahim, a violin virtuoso. So the first movement of this piece was composed by Dietrich, the second and fourth movement by Schumann, and the third movement by Brahms. So this sonata was composed in the year of 1853. The year Fairytales, which we will be playing, was composed as well. So this year is really significant because after 1853, Schumann started to have a decline in his mental health. So Fairytales and many other pieces were composed towards the end of his life. So around this time, it was really known for Schumann's creative period in his compositional career. And this piece, Fairytales, was dedicated to Albert Dietrich, which was part of that same social circle. Next one. So during the Romantic period, it was really a revolutionary and innovative period for music. So composers really focused on bringing out more expression and intense feelings through the music. A lot of Romantic music was inspired by poetry and art, while the Classical period kind of depended on like a strict form, like very clean lines, balance, and clarity. And the Romantic period focused more on complex structures based on the messiness of the human condition. So to kind of get a good picture in your head, the left side is classical and the right side is Romantic. So it's really just a form of classical is very like, I don't want to say man-made, but very just structured in a base, where Romantic is really an experimental time in this time of Schumann's life. So Schumann was heavily inspired by the author J.P. Richer, which Christine will talk about later, and composers really began to experiment with different harmonies, dissonance, and started to depart from like the classical style of music. So Schumann really messed around with different voicings and styles, and the fact that he used viola in this piece, Fairytales, is really unique because prior to this piece, only Mozart had written a trio for piano, viola, and clarinet. So I really believe like the instrumentation behind this piece was inspired by the friendships surrounding Schumann. And for like more detail in the Romantic evidence of the theory, Quinton's going to talk more about that.
Thank you. All right, I chose to title my section of this Order Out of Chaos. It's based on a quote by Robert Schumann about how it's the job of the composer to take all of these just ideas out of the ether and put them down on a score. And I've actually spent a lot of time with this score, actually we all have. And during that time, a lot of differences such as phrase structure, chord choice, as Lewis was saying, instructions, etc. have come to light as far as Romantic versus Classical era. Yeah, some of these advancements are a departure from the standard 4-bar phrase construction or chord progression, and many elisions, which are when one melody ends, when one phrase ends, the next picks up at the exact same spot. And also the use of more complex extended chords such as 9th, 11th, 13th, etc., which you'll also hear in this piece. And next slide, please. So an example of that is on the left, we have Mozart Piano Sonata in B flat. It's a standard 8-bar phrase plus a 2-bar extension, 1, 5, 7, 1. On the right, on the right is the Schumann we're going to be playing today. You can't really see it, but it starts with a 5-bar phrase, and as I end my phrase, Lewis begins his phrase, and then so on. And then also at the bottom right there is a 13th chord. Yeah. Okay, can you flip back one more time? No. All right. Also, keys became a bigger influence. When I say keys became a bigger influence, I meant that each composer had their specific key that they would go to. Brahms, B flat, example, and they would use that as a reflection of mood and when they wanted to get a certain tone. And example, Shostakovich, but also in the fourth movement, which we will not be performing, there's also an E flat section. And then also, like the markings, dynamics, nuances, articulations also became much more important. And this is actually really ironic because the whole idea of the Romantic era was the fact that this freedom of expression and just losing all sense of boundary, but by like composers putting so many like articulations and instructions, the performer loses their own ability to put their own creative spark into the music. And also, as I'll explain later, when I talk about the forms of each movement, like none of these forms are new. It's just like the way the composers in the Romantic era use these forms that actually makes the Romantic era the Romantic era. So the first movement, my German's bad, but lebhaft, nicht zu schnell, lively, not too fast. The key's B flat major, and the form is a modified sonata allegro. So you're going to have your exposition, development, recap, and a codetta to round it out. Second movement, lebhaft und sehr markiert, lively and very marcato. Key G minor with an E flat major section, and then back to G minor. The form is ternary, so ABA. Next one. And third movement, ruhig tempo mit zarten Ausdruck. Relaxed tempo with tender expression. Key G major and a simple rounded binary, so AB, A prime. And lastly, the fourth movement, which is lebhaft, sehr markiert, lively, very marcato, B flat major, G flat major, and then back to B flat. And the form is ternary again, so ABA. And in conclusion, I hope you're all able to see and understand the differences between the eras. Hopefully I did my job in pointing those out. And now, with that being said, I will hand it over to Christine.
Hi. So now that we've focused on the theoretical aspect of this music, along with the social inspirations that Schumann was heavily surrounded by, it's really critical to the understanding of this piece to discuss how those two elements come together. So first and foremost, I'd like to debunk the miscommunication and misconception that personas are multiple personalities. In Schumann's case, they're not. Personas or doppelgangers were heavily used in 19th century art culture. They were used in literature and poetry, and what was unique to Schumann is that he brought these things into the world of music, which was really a unique thing of that time. And that's not to say that he didn't have a mental illness. It's just to say that the personas that he has in his music aren't necessarily multiple personalities that he may have been experiencing or may not have. So with that being said, where did these personas come from? Well, it was documented that Schumann was heavily influenced by Richter's book. So sorry, but yes, we're just saying F, but it roughly means awkward adolescent phase. So Volt, through the twin characters, Volt, who had a sparkling intelligence, and that's Walt, who had a sparkling intellect, and then Volt, who was very poetic, really led to the creation of Eusebius and Florestan, who are some of the most commonly used personas in Schumann's music. They first appeared in his diary when he was 21, and they were shown to be best friends. Schumann himself described himself as a musical visionary, yet shy and tongue-tied, and later went on to describe Eusebius and Florestan as Eusebius the mild and Florestan the wild, which, if you think about it, is quite fitting for a potentially awkward 21-year-old young man. So, And, oh, there's a third one that we hear in this piece. Master Rohr, who is inspired by Friedrich Wieck, was Schumann's piano professor, mentor for many years, and also the father of Clara Schumann, who was his long-term partner, love, and that kind of goes back into what Lewis was saying about the social influences. Schumann did have a lot of these, and they really are showcased through his music. And writing these personas were premiered in his Notizienwerk für Musik, or New Music Journal. But when did they shine through in Schumann's music? Well, they were debuted in Papillons, which is titled Butterflies, in 1831. They were titled accordingly in Carnival, which is a 24-movement character piece written in 1834 to 35. However, Schumann started to make his characters distinct with tempo markings, and that's shown in David's Bundelkhausen, or the League of David, in 1837. So that's really unique as well, because our piece was written in 1853, and he showcases his personas in our piece as well through tempo markings. Next slide, please. To just talk briefly about what you will be hearing today and the character indications. So the first movement is Lebhaft nicht zu schnell. I see Florenstein, Eusebius, and Mr. Rohr in this piece. For the most part, the quarter and eighth note bass line make for a very grounded and solid, distinct figure over what's happening in the different melodic material. You hear Eusebius come through with this very melodic and beautiful hello, if you will. And then Florenstein really breaks through and kind of interrupts all of the beauty that's going on. So Lewis will play you the lyrical passage of Eusebius, and this is something to listen for during this movement. And Quinton will now play the Florenstein element of this movement. So you hear the difference between Lewis's and then the bass line, you'll hear a very grounded but in the right time when we get to that. Excuse me for that. So that's one of the ways that Schumann is really creating this dialogue. And as Quinton was saying about elisions, it really is a dialogue. And so using these different characters and using these elisions, that's where that conversation comes into. We never really start, stop even though we begin. So in the second movement, lively and very marked, this is definitely totally Florenstein. They're best friends. He's really critical of Eusebius. He is satirical, witty, sharp, harsh, and raw yet articulate and blunt, but also quite playful in nature. The large dominating chords ignite this character from the very beginning. Whoa, right? However, there's a flip-flopping of aggression and lightheartedness, and this is indicated through longer and shorter beats in this movement. The middle section also brings in a really satirical yet playful and out-of-the-blue dance color, and this is kind of just the showcasing of how Florenstein is very playful yet quite intense at times. So Lewis and Quinton will play the dance-like nature so you can hear the contrast. So that's really different than dun dun da, 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 da. So we hope that you can hear that. After that section happens, we quickly return to the darker character of this G minor section because obviously Florenstein does not have time for romantic daydreams. So in the third movement, which is very much so Eusebius, a quiet time with tender expression, we see this philosophical side of Eusebius coming out. It's dreamy and nostalgic, gentle, sweet, but very open to musical tastes, ideas, and contemplation. the dialogue between instruments is especially critical for this piece to make that image that Schumann really wants us to portray. And again, it's it's very indicative of a conversation he may have had with his friends. Again, as Lewis mentioned, it's also coming from the mind of a man who's had his career, right? It's after his career, and not after his career, but he's older, he knows it, he's thinking back upon these times, he's probably inspired by those young composers that are all around him, and whether it's a conversation with himself or with others, this is a very nostalgic movement. The fourth movement is Florenstein. So this is very much Schumann to end on a Florenstein note, because he's very like, hello world, I'm here. In conclusion, I hope that you guys can hear this dialogue through the movements. And it's kind of like Quinton was saying, there is no room for mistaking these personas. He's very specific, and it's like meeting a person. They're gonna have the same mannerisms, the same grammar, but their moods may change, you know, but their intonation is probably gonna be the same, and it's the same respect that Schumann demands of his characters. So we hope that you can hear this. Thank you.
But Schumann would have wanted us to tune and play in tune, so we're going to do that real quick.